despite going through the American public school system and being beat over the head about how monopolies are a bad thing and Rockefeller was a bad guy and Vanderbilt was a bad, these monopolists are evil. But despite that, America still maintains a monopoly on the single greatest communicative tool that human beings use outside of language, outside of verbal communication. There is no single unit, there is no single practice or exercise that humans use to express or display their values more than money. So it's incredibly important that the market be allowed to decide and determine what is money, not by decree or by edict, but by market forces.
Monaco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with JP Cortez. He's the executive director of Sound Money Defense League. And yes, they're one of the US's leading gold and silver public policy group. Their motto is bringing gold and silver back as America's constitutional money. And I think that's great. Even though I'm in the UK, I think if the US moves towards sound money, it will affect the whole world. So, JP, welcome to the channel. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well, Mario. Thank you for having me on. I've been a long-time viewer, so it's great to be chatting with you.
Great. So maybe you can talk about what's going on in the world of sound money. And it looks like it's something more grassroots than federal in the US. More
Absolutely. Yeah, that's absolutely the case. So the Sound Money Defense League, we're a project of Money Metals Exchange, a national online bullion dealer. And we are a public policy group. We're a nonpartisan group that advocates for the remonetization of gold and silver. We have found that the reason that gold and silver are not primarily used as money today is not because anyone necessarily prefers the dollar or wants to use the dollar, but rather because of the impediments and the regulations and the disincentives that have been placed on any potential alternatives. In many cases here in the United States, when you buy precious metals, you might get hit with a state sales tax. In many states, when you sell the precious metals or use them, you're going to get hit with a state capital gains tax, and then the feds will tax you a third time potentially. So gold and silver are not workable as money right now. There's too much friction involved because of the regulations and the disincentives placed on it by governments and regulators. So we go state to state, removing all of those disincentives. So we go state to state advocating for the elimination of sales tax on purchases of gold and silver coins, bars, and rounds, on the elimination of the capital gains tax when you sell the asset. If there's a gain, we advocate for the state not taxing that gain. We advocate for empowering state treasurers, state financiers to invest state funds in physical metals, many times stored within the state. We're talking about bolstering public pension funds and reserve funds and rainy day funds with physical precious metals. And we also work to remove some of the regulations that currently harm a lot of the dealers here in the state. There are a lot of really onerous regulations that make compliance and make doing business in precious metals difficult here in the United States. So we've worked now for 10 years. This is our 10-year anniversary advocating for gold and silver in this manner. And I'm happy to say that it's our most successful year yet. Just this year, we have worked on 7 successful legislative campaigns. 7 state governors have signed legislation into law, removing these taxes, putting impediments in the way of the state foisting a CBDC or a central bank digital currency on residents of any given state. And again, empowering treasurers to invest actual funds in gold and silver. So it has been extremely productive. Like I mentioned, this year it was 7 successes. Last year it was 5. The year before that it was 4. So we are seeing the momentum move in favor of sound money. And it's not just states, it's not just individuals, right? We're seeing this happen globally as well. The process of de-dollarization is something that's been very hot recently on everyone's mind. And then we talk about Russia and India and Czech Republic and Poland, all of these countries that have been notably increasing their gold reserves for years now. And it's kind of interesting to look at that with the perspective that that's viewed in as sort of been a macro view of the global state of play. But it's not just countries with an adversarial relationship to the United States that would have an interest in a money without counterparty risk. states themselves are also moving away from dollar denominated assets and they're looking at gold. And of course, individuals more than ever today have more access to gold and silver. You know, the Costco phenomenon being one of those examples of retail investors having more access to these alternatives to sound money, or rather to these alternatives to the fiat dollar in the form of sound money than there has ever been before. So it's an incredibly bullish, in my opinion, time to be interested in and to be studying and to be pursuing policies that benefit and advocate for the use of gold and silver, not just as savings, but as money.
It's interesting you mentioned these sovereign nations like Russia, even China, uh, India, and others that are trying to de-dollarize. And it's even like the term de-dollarize is technically not right. It's defederalized because it's the Federal Reserve note, right?
Mm-hmm.
You probably know that the definition of a dollar is a weight of silver and gold constitutionally. But it's interesting because we're seeing this de-dollarization from major nations across the planet that want to be sovereign and independent and not liable to sanctions from the US. But also in the US, we're seeing it come from the grassroots, from the individuals. And I've heard people, I think it was Jay Powell, he was being questioned in Congress, and they said, well, yeah, in 1913, Congress outsourced the management of our currency to the Federal Reserve. And I think that's technically not right because the Federal Reserve doesn't really issue any money. It issues credit, a credit note, the Federal Reserve note.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe you could talk a little bit about the fact that from 1836 to 1914, and I know the Federal Reserve Act was passed in 1913, but the Fed started running only in
Mm-hmm.
1914. So for 78 years, America didn't have a central bank. And to me, I don't know if you think like this, the Federal Reserve is a little bit like the health agencies. They seem to be like not improving anything, the people's health, and they're punishing people for doing certain things. And it seems that the Federal Reserve is the original agency that uh, doesn't want the public to have sound money. So I'll let you respond to that.
I think that you're absolutely right in that. Well, to be clear, we'll start here. The idea that the Fed is an independent institution is a myth. This is an arm of the government that seeks to empower or allow the federal government to do what it wants to do. So, starting with that understanding, I think that we find that the Federal Reserve suffers from the same shortcomings that all government institutions suffer from. That is, a lack of incentives that are aligned with the people that you are said to be serving, and also very little incentive to improve, in part because your customers are being held at gunpoint. So, in the case of the Federal Reserve, right, like I mentioned earlier, the reason we use the Federal Reserve note, which is such a great point that you made, it's not the US dollar. The US dollar was constitutional, it used to mean something. This is a paper note that was it's money by edict. It's not real money. So this fiat dollar is not a dollar at all. It's a paper note. And that's a point that I've made and tried to make to legislators when talking about this, because it's an important point to understand. The Federal Reserve note has wrought the debatably worst financial conditions that America has seen since 1929. And the kind of beauty, or maybe not beauty, but the Orwellian nature really of that is that these institutions purport to be in favor of supporting people and helping people. And in the case of the Federal Reserve, you have the dual mandate where you're supposed to, you're talking about maximum employment and price stability. And the result of all of that has been a precipitous decline in the purchasing power of the Federal Reserve note. Today, since 1913, the Federal Reserve note has lost about 97% of its purchasing power. The time before the Federal Reserve was debatably the most greatest, most illustrious, most booming time in American history. The Gilded Age, the Industrial Revolution. These were across the world, we were able to, through commercialization, through industrialization, through markets, we were able to help people's life expectancy grow very high. We were able to reduce things like poverty and things like hunger. People were living longer than ever. They were living more fulfilled lives than they ever had. And on the base of that, technocrats and bankers created a system, as I'm sure through Cloak and Dagger in the back room at Jekyll Island, the great book there, The Creature of Jekyll Island. And they created a system that doesn't help the average person. In fact, that hurts the average person through what is known as the Cantillon effect in Austrian economics. The idea that the people closest to the central bankers, that is to say other bankers, politicians, those most closely tied to the financial system, they receive new money first. When the central bank creates credit, like you said, or gives out loans, they are the ones that receive the new money first. And by the time that money trickles down to average consumers like you or me, prices have adjusted. So, and in fact, the purchasing power of that money has been squashed. And so people are actually actively harmed more so, while those richest and most benefited by this system are actively helped. So the system, to be sure, is working the way it's supposed to. Being able to empowering the government to weaponize its dollar, to be able to use it as a cudgel to harm your enemies with or to help your friends with. I think that was the intention of the Federal Reserve, and that speaks to the importance of sound money. Because like we said earlier, it's not just adversarial countries that are looking at this system that the US is obviously weighing and using politically, wielding for political purposes. And many people all over the world are saying, wait, there has to be a system that whose monetary value doesn't depend on the whims of politicians or my relationships with those neighboring countries. There has to be a better money than that. And historically, there always has been. It's only for the last 100 years, a little more than 100 years, that the global financial system moved from a gold standard to a PhD standard. It was a standard built by technocrats who are telling you, hey, we know better than what has been good money for thousands of years. Our complex regressions, our ability to do intense different economic regressions can point us in the direction. We can find the exact number that we need to ratchet the economy to so that everyone can prosper. And that's just simply not the case. It fundamentally misunderstands human interactions and markets and people coming together to apply their means to meet their ends. So humans act rationally. The Austrian concept of humans acting in their best available means to reach their available ends. And so to try to top-down plan this is a great point that you made earlier about the importance and the effects of grassroots in all of this, right? A top-down monetary system where, if, for example, if Congress were to reenact a gold standard, we'll say a congressional act that reenacts a gold standard where the Federal Reserve note is pegged to a value or weight of gold. I think that too misunderstands the folly of top-down approaches. We don't necessarily need a congressional gold standard. More than anything, we just need the government to get out of the way. Gold and silver have been money for thousands of years, regardless of whether government laws or government edicts or executive orders say that is the case. So by simply removing them and allowing for competition in money, a denationalization of money, as F.A. Hayek, Nobel Prize winning economist, said, by allowing for there to be a more robust competition in money, what we'll see is that we don't necessarily have to accept as fact that our money perpetually loses 2% a year by design, right? This is the Federal Reserve's entire stated purpose. They're intentionally devaluing the purchasing power of our money by 2% every single year. And of course, the numbers today much higher than that. If anyone's walked into a grocery store or paid an energy bill, they know that it's not 2% a year. But we can reimagine a money that does not make these sort of assumptions and hold them as true. And we do that by looking backwards and seeing what has worked historically as money. And gold and silver are that. And that's why it's so important that we remonetize and we unlock gold and silver's capacity as money.
Yes, and I think the U.S. Constitution and the Coinage Act that the U.S. has had, the purpose of Congress and government is to regulate the weights and measures of gold and silver coins. And sometimes they have to change those weights depending on whether gold and silver start flowing out of the country because the ratio changes with other countries. And I don't know if you know this, I think up until 1862, there were no legal tender laws in the US. So people used gold and silver coins from everywhere around the world,
Mhm.
and it was accepted as payment. And yeah, so maybe you could touch upon that. And then after that, we're going to look into what you're doing actually in terms of grassroots and what states you're working on. So maybe you touch upon that, how because some people find it difficult. They think, oh, if we allow Congress to regulate the value of money, they're gonna print money, but it's got nothing to do with that, right? And then the federal government also provides a mint where I could take some gold and they mint a $5 gold piece for me, right?
It's so interesting looking back at the history of money here in the States and juxtaposing with what that looks like today. So, for example, you mentioned there was no real quote unquote standard, there was no legal tender because there at the time were no real US mints. Gold and silver were coming and minted from all over the world. And so long as the weight and the purity was verifiable, it was good money. Today, it's really interesting to see legislatively how this is playing out. Many individuals, many groups, there have been projects that have been pushing legal tender, wanting to declare gold and silver legal tender. And our approach over the years, we've moved on this, and we've sort of reached the idea that we sort of have been misunderstanding what legal tender it is and how we should approach it. All right, legal tender, the Legal Tender Acts of 1862, like you were saying, was Lincoln's attempt to fund a civil war, but he wasn't able to do that with gold-backed money. So what he did was printed these continentals, what are known as greenbacks. He printed them, and this was America's first hyperinflationary event. He printed them and he imbued them with monetary properties because they did not naturally have them. So they needed the force of law to come in and say, this is good money, similar to that of your gold. And of course, there was everything that came after that. There were Supreme Court cases that tried these questions. And then, of course, the Federal Reserve establishment in 1913, and then Nixon severing the closing the gold window finally in 1971. But so now what we're seeing today is the process where gold has to be remonetized. And more people, I think people have been interested, or over the last 10 years have been taking the approach to say, well, we need to make gold and silver legal tender. And again, this is a top-down approach that sort of misunderstands the ethos of freedom money and the importance of sound money and the U.S. Constitution. This liberty, freedom is literally baked into the firmware. It's in the United States Code that Americans embody. So having gold and silver as money is not something that we should be necessarily looking to the government to permit or to stamp with a seal of approval. The imprimatur of the government is not what we need to make good money. What makes good money is divisibility, is fungibility, is transportability, is medium of widely acceptance as payment. These are properties that make good money. And so the legal tender issue is esoteric many times, and it's very academic, and frankly a lot of people don't really understand what it means. And that's why for our purposes, more than passing and writing these laws that say gold and silver are legal tender, which, to be fair, are laws that we're working on. Just this year, Louisiana passed a bill saying that gold and silver are legal tender in the state of Louisiana. But what we have found is that functionally, practically, there is very little substance to a bill like this. What we've found is that more people would benefit if we simply removed the friction on either side in the form of taxes. Because I think that's a large part of the misunderstanding of legal tender. People believe that if you declare something legal tender, this means that its tax status has been changed. And that's not necessarily the case. For example, in Oklahoma, 10 years ago, they passed a bill that said gold and silver are legal tender. But in the state of Oklahoma, since we have not yet proactively exempted capital gains from gold and silver, you're still going to get hit with this tax. So it doesn't actually affect one's ability to use the money, especially not in the sense of some of this legislation is often written very ambiguously. And someone can write a bill saying there's no tax liability on gold and silver. And obviously, that's what we want. We want it to be treated as a non-entity for taxation purposes. But to write legislation like that sort of empowers regulators and lawmakers to ambiguously interpret these laws that we frankly don't trust them to enforce properly. So it's important that when we're writing this legislation, we're not making grand sweeping statements and we're not making anything ambiguous. We're not saying anything ambiguous. We're going directly into the state statutes, going into the tax codes, and surgically inserting or removing the things that are keeping gold and silver from their use. So legal tender is, I think, to the extent that more people are talking about gold and silver today than they have in decades, this is a very positive thing. But as far as moving policy forward, the biggest impediments right now aren't whether or not gold and silver are declared legal tender by any given state, but rather all of the regulations and the restrictions keeping gold and silver from their actual use.
Yes, I mean, legal tender laws are only necessary, like you said, during times of war, the Civil War, because basically the government doesn't have real money to finance
Mm-hmm.
the war. So they need to force people to accept an empty paper promise.
Mm-hmm.
That's all I was trying to say. I'm not saying that you shouldn't work on making gold and silver legal tender because it sounds contradictory, but if you have a system where the Federal Reserve note is legal tender, it's the only way you can compete. But in an ideal world, what I was trying to say is we don't need legal tender laws. So maybe you could talk about like the projects that you've completed, the success you've had in 2024, and maybe talk about the prospects for next year. I mean, half my viewers are in the US, even though I'm in the UK, and maybe tell them how they can get involved in trying to wake the public up about sound money. Some people don't even know what sound money is.
You're absolutely right. And I think that that's part of the reason that education is so important to what we're doing here, why channels like yours are so important, and why I am super grateful for the opportunity to speak to legislators in many cases. There are more than 8,000 elected state legislators in the United States, the vast majority of which have never heard the term sound money, have never questioned what money is or why we use it, what would make a good money, what properties make a good money, what should money be backed by a commodity or an asset by some sort. These are questions that the lawmakers that are impacting our lives every day have never asked themselves. So being able to directly make these arguments, these compelling arguments for sound money to the people making decisions that affect our lives every day is extremely important. And so I'm super grateful for that opportunity, the platform to talk to lawmakers. On top of that, on top of educating, we're also making a actual discernible difference. Like I mentioned, this year we worked on 7 successful legislative projects. In 2024, 27 states across the United States introduced more than 65 pieces of legislation. This is such a far cry from what it was 10 years ago when I was writing a piece of legislation and running state to state, begging legislators, hey, please consider carrying this bill, please sponsor this bill. And at the time, it was very, very difficult to find people willing to back these issues, to put their names to these issues. That's not necessarily a sexy or very popular issue to the average American consumer. So there were very few politicians willing to put their name on this. 10 years later, I can happily say that that's absolutely not the case. We are regularly reached out to by people in the state and by lawmakers themselves wanting to bring these sound money successes that we've had across the country to their own states. So in 2024, we worked to eliminate the sales tax on purchases of gold and silver coins, bars, and rounds in the states of Wisconsin and Wyoming. This is important because they became the 44th and the 45th state in the country to eliminate this tax. The goal is to make the tax on purchases of precious metals extinct here in the United States. There's no reason for it to exist. And only 5 remain now. Of the 5 that remain, we have active legislation in all 5 of them in the upcoming year to eliminate this tax. So we're very hopeful. We're making great progress on this issue. And it's important because in the case of New Jersey and Wisconsin, it requires knowing a little bit about the internal politics of the United States. But both of these states, in Wisconsin's case, may be purple, but primarily a blue state. And in New Jersey's case, a very, very deep blue state. These are states that are not necessarily known for being low tax states or states that regularly introduce or pass tax cuts. But despite an overwhelming blue majority in both states, in the case of New Jersey, we eliminated the sales tax on precious metals without a single dissenting vote. Not a single lawmaker in the New Jersey Assembly or in the New Jersey Senate voted no on this bill because they know that inflation is not a partisan issue. Sound money isn't a partisan issue. So those are the sales tax successes that we've had just this year. In Nebraska and Alabama, we ended the capital gains tax, the state capital gains tax. So in both of those states now, the 2 major points of friction, buying and being taxed and selling and being taxed, have been removed. So people can more functionally use the metals in these states as money if they wanted to. In Nebraska, we passed legislation to, like I mentioned, eliminate the capital gains, but also we had legislation that introduced anti-CBDC language. This, like I mentioned earlier, this is language that says that the residents of Nebraska cannot have a central bank digital currency foisted upon them. They cannot be forced to pay taxes in it. They cannot be forced to transact in it. And that's such an important part right now because central bank digital currencies are such a huge privacy risk to the average American, to the global consumer. It also introduces a real risk of economic engineering that doesn't exist today, right? The Federal Reserve or the federal government's ability to, let's say we want to tax savings accounts. Let's say we want to do zero interest rate policies. Having the lever, everyone having a master bank account at the Fed and their ability to turn that switch on and off introduces an entire new level of risk. So for that reason, CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, are a huge risk that states are actively mitigating against as well. Like I mentioned, in Louisiana, there was the legal tender, the symbolic legal tender law that was passed. And then Utah was a growth on a bill that had previously passed, but it was a bill that empowered the state treasurer to invest gold in state funds by specifically designating the funds in which the state is allowed to invest the metals in. After having spoken to the sponsor several times over the last couple months, it sounds like Utah has been approved for a $180 million investment of physical gold to be held on their balance sheet. And they're in the process of figuring out how to best acquire that, whether in tranches or what form to best acquire it. But like we mentioned, this is all symbolic of a larger movement where states themselves are no longer feeling comfortable holding solely dollar-denominated assets. And frankly, they have a fiduciary responsibility to the state and to the residents, the citizens of that state, to ensure that the state's savings are protected.
It's interesting that you say it doesn't matter if it's a blue or red state. Most people want sound money, especially with all the inflation we've had. Well, since 1913, really. It's not just recent. You also said that there's only 5 states where there's a sales tax on gold and silver. And what about capital gains tax? Are how many states are left that still have capital gains tax on when you sell gold and silver?
So with the addition of Alabama and Nebraska this year, we're up to 13 states that have eliminated the capital gains tax. If my math is right, I believe that leaves 37. And And so, yes, there is more work to be done on the capital gains front. We started with the sales tax side because it's an easier argument to make. More people can easily understand why you shouldn't be taxing the purchase of money versus trying to understand an argument about how the state would be taxing a phantom gain because the nominal price of gold rising is actually a devaluation of the purchasing power of the dollar. That argument is a little more difficult for lawmakers to get their minds around. So we've started with the sales tax. And because of the success of all the sales tax projects, we have found that states that have passed the sales tax issue have reached back out and said, what can we do next? What is left to do? What is the next thing to do to remonetize constitutional money? So there is definitely more work to be done on the capital gains side, but we have more projects at this point that are capital gains related than sales tax related, just because there are so few sales tax states that still impose that tax.
Yeah, this is a really important point here that well, I think it is. Do you think this grassroots movement of making people more aware of constitutional money, gold and silver, and make it easier for them to buy and sell, do you think that will eventually lead to competition against the Federal Reserve because it's such a powerful institution, an agency that's not only controlled by government but by the big Wall Street banks, I would say. What's the hope that you have? And how would it work if the U.S. was able to abolish the Federal Reserve Act? I personally don't think it would be really hard to go back to sound money, but there's so much currency that's been issued and so much debt, and people forget that the debt has another side, which is the credit or you know the the government programs that they have to pay people with. Yeah, maybe you could finish off and give your opinion on that. Basically, a war between sound money and the central bank.
The goal is to introduce that sort of competition. The idea is that currently, as it stands, the United States government and the Federal Reserve have a monopoly on money. And anyone who's studied economics understands the shortcomings of monopoly, how that often leads to higher prices, how it leads to lower quality goods and services. And yet, despite going through the American public school system and being beat over the head about how monopolies are a bad thing and Rockefeller was a bad guy and Vanderbilt was these monopolists are evil. But despite that, America still maintains a monopoly on the single greatest communicative tool that human beings use outside of language, outside of verbal communication. There is no single unit. There is no single practice or exercise that humans use to express or display their values more than money. So it's incredibly important that the market be allowed to decide and determine what is money, not by decree or by edict, but by market forces. The idea is to introduce competition to the dollar will hopefully force America's stewards to be better managers of America's money, to stop using it for political purposes, to stop devaluing it or overvaluing it, depending on what the situation is, depending on who you're interacting with. More and more around the world, we're finding that the counterparty risk is among the largest risks that exist. And most people have very little concept of what counterparty risk is, or have very little concept of what a note is, a bank note, which is to say, before on a gold standard, this was redeemable in gold. And now this is it's a debt. It's a debt paper. It's an IOU. So understanding these and helping to better educate the American people and the global economy on what monetary properties in an ideal money look like is so important. And it creates that competition, right? And we're seeing it all over. We're doing it on the state level by introducing gold and silver as money, but Russia is doing it. They're doing it at the BRICS summit right now in Russia when they're talking about gold-backed currencies or some sort of alternative to the U.S. dollar system or payment system. Zimbabwe did it when the Zimbabwe ZiG currency, they backed by gold in the last few months. Of course, it's worth noting that establishing a gold-backed currency is very different from maintaining one. The fiscal discipline required, the long-term planning required to establish and maintain a gold-backed money is not for the weary. And frankly, all of the incentives that politicians have are not aligned with restoring a sound money, right? These are expedient politicians that many times have to win a re-election every 2 to 4 years. Talking about sound money requires lowering your time preference, to use the Austrian idea of time preference, way, way down and look way to the future. Because ultimately, that's how improvements in humanity happen. It's the foregoing of spending today so that we can invest tomorrow in infrastructure, in health, and if in inventions, and all of the things that make life worth living, that make life easier and more fulfilling. All of that, the sound money is a necessary condition, not just a sufficient condition, but a necessary condition for the flourishing of humanity. So to introduce competition to the dollar, ultimately, yeah, that is to the Federal Reserve note, I should say. Ultimately, that is the goal, in the hopes that they will continue, or rather, that they will begin to stop funding global wars of choice all around the world, and to look at America's entitlement system and consider the bankruptcy that America is facing, to look at public pension funds and consider the crisis that is unfolding in that arena. So by reinstating principles and stability and soundness to America's money, we can restore that Gilded Age. We can restore that Industrial Revolution. We can have that type of growth again. But it requires a money that can't be manipulated and weaponized by politicians. So we're introducing that competition to ensure that they get their act together.
And I think what you're doing is great, trying to educate not just the public, but also the state representatives. As you said, there's like 8,000 of them. I remember meeting Ron Paul at the Mises Institute like many years ago. And he told me about a story when he was in Congress, and he used to be in the House Finance Committee, I think it's called, and uh, ask questions of Greenspan, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, every 6 months. And he once brought this essay that Greenspan wrote in 1966, Golden Economic Freedom. And he asked Greenspan, "Do you still believe in all that?" And he said, "Yes, 100%." And Greenspan said, "The only reason why we still don't have sound money and gold is because the public don't want it. The public like inflation." So I think educating the public about the virtues of sound money is really important. And I think you're doing a great job. So maybe before we wrap up, you could tell the viewers how they can connect to your organization.
Absolutely. You can find us at soundmoneydefense.org. On our site, you will see that there is a form there to enter your email and your zip code. If you have any interest in sound money legislation, if you want to be an active participant in some of these legislative battles, I strongly encourage you to sign up for these updates. What we do is send out key information if in your state for committee hearings and key votes. So, for example, if you live in Nashville, Tennessee, and you put your email and your zip code, when there is a bill, when there is a important vote taking place, we will reach out to you with contact information for all the legislators, phone numbers, emails. Many times we include a pre-written message as well. So we make it very, very easy for people to get involved with these legislative projects. And I encourage everyone to do that, because it is certainly the case that people are not necessarily hopeful about the efficacy of federal politics. But the truth is that you still have power in your state legislature. If you're in Lincoln, Nebraska, or Salem, Oregon, or Trenton, New Jersey, you can call DC and maybe an intern will pick up. Maybe the congressman will get your message. Maybe you'll hear back. Maybe you won't. But in the case of calling your state capital, in case of lighting up that switchboard, all it takes is a handful of calls and emails for legislators at the state level to say, wait, this is an important issue. Many people are reaching out. And ultimately, that is the difference. That is the strongest tool in our toolbox when it comes to passing these pieces of legislation. legislators hearing from people in the state about why they should support this bill. So I would encourage everyone, on the sound money front or otherwise, on other topics that may interest you. I encourage you to realize and to harness the power that you still have at the state level. And if you're interested in sound money, please sign up for the alerts. We send out this information, and it is a crucial part to getting these bills passed. So yeah, that's where you can find us. You can find me on Twitter. My handle is or X. You can find me. My handle is at JP Cortez 27. And if you're in one of these states that has policies towards gold and silver that are less than fair, that are not good, and you want to change that, please reach out to me. You can find my contact information on the website. We are happy to work with people in the state to get these projects on their legs and eventually to get them across the finish line.
Great, JP. It was really nice speaking with you, and hopefully we'll do another interview soon, and so you can keep us updated. With that, I wish you a great day.
Thank you, Mario. It was great chatting with you.
Thank you.